Welcome to True Bill Talk, a podcast about the realities of being a prosecutor, challenges in the field, and how we can make our criminal justice system work better for everyone. My name is Alyssa Marquederi, and I'm the director of the Vanderbilt Project on Prosecution Policy, also known as VPOP, here at Vanderbilt Law School. I've been in the criminal justice policy space for 5 years, and through this time, I've met and worked with a lot of interesting, really smart and creative people. One of the people at the top of that list is Jared Fishman, who founded and now directs the Justice Innovation Lab. Jared has had a unique career path. He's worked in war-torn parts of the world before becoming a civil rights prosecutor at the Department of Justice in D.C. for 14 years. He wrote a book called Fire on the Levee about the murder of a black man by New Orleans police officers, which members of the police department then covered up. You can search for Fire on the Levee and VPOP on YouTube and watch a recording of a panel VPOP hosted a couple months ago, where Jared and FBI Special Agent Ashley Johnson talk about this fascinating case that he wrote about in his book. And it's a case that they investigated and prosecuted together. After leaving DOJ during the pandemic, Jared launched the Justice Innovation Lab, which helps prosecutors use data to see where they can be more fair and effective. All of his experiences give him insight into why people, whether it's defendants or police or prosecutors, behave as they do and how we can improve the system for everyone. One reason I love working with Jared and his team at the Justice Innovation Lab is that they, like us at VPOP, find real value in working with DAs from across the political spectrum. Both of us have worked with DAs in major urban coastal cities, but also smaller and more conservative jurisdictions too. And in a highly partisan and polarized environment, it's a bit hard to find people willing and able to engage with a wide range of prosecutors who don't always agree on the toughest issues in our field. Jared is able to do that, which I think is hugely important if we want to make changes across the country and not just in big cities. One last thing I'll say before getting to the interview is that VPOP and the Justice Innovation Lab launched a joint accelerator program earlier this year. And as part of that program, we worked with 6 DA's offices across the country to identify a specific problem in their justice system and develop a solution to address it. And not just solve it internally within the DA's office, but in collaboration with other stakeholders in the community, whether it be judges, victim advocates, or law enforcement officers. We talk a little bit about the Accelerator program in this interview, and I want to highlight it because it's a unique program that culminates in a 3-day workshop at Vanderbilt Law School. And as anyone who attended the workshop this past October will tell you, participants walk away with an idea ready to pilot back at home. And they have a ton of fun in the process of coming up with that solution. I attribute a lot of that to Jared, who busted out his guitar during the conference and took everyone honky-tonking on Broadway the last night we were in town. If that doesn't pique your interest in participating in a future accelerator program, I don't know what will. And as a side note, for those of you who live in Tennessee or you know Nashville really well, if you want to participate in the program but you just can't bring yourself to hang out on Broadway with a bunch of out-of-towners, I promise I'll come up with an alternative good music itinerary for you too. Anyway, it's rare to find someone as sharp and fun to work with as Jared, so I had to bring him on the show. I hope you enjoy the conversation. So I always like to start with my guest's personal background. So anything you're willing to tell me. I know you grew up in Atlanta. I don't know anything about your family though. And then sort of, how you eventually landed up, say, in law school. We'll handle after law school later.
So I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia. I grew up to a Jewish family that was very much focused on social justice. Spent a lot of time with the concept called tikkun olam, which means that the world is broken and that each of us have a responsibility to fix it. So when I went to, after I graduated high school and went to college, I got really interested in the Middle East. I spent a lot of time working on the Middle Eastern peace process, and some of my early, more formative experiences were working with teenagers from war zones. So I worked for an amazing organization called Seeds of Peace, and it started as a summer camp that brought together primarily Israelis and Palestinians, but ultimately teenagers from other conflict zones. And the thought was if we can bring people together in proximity, get to see each other as humans and live together, that maybe we can solve some of these really hard problems. And so I worked at that summer camp while I was in college and found the experience just profound because of what that proximity did in terms of deepening understanding of the problems, of the tensions, and more importantly, how we can begin to overcome them. And so when I graduated college in 1999, Seeds of Peace was opening a regional center in Jerusalem. The idea was that the center could then provide year-round support to kids in the Middle East who were going to continue this work. And that meant doing presentations in schools. That meant bringing kids across borders into each other's homes. It meant doing deep exploratory projects on history, for example. And it was an amazing time period. The year, a year into my time living there, the second intifada broke out. Violence became a daily norm. Over the course of about 3 years, 4,000 people died in the fighting, 1,000 Israelis, 3,000 Palestinians, and including one of my campers, a 17-year-old boy named Asil Asleh. Asil had been at a protest, and during that protest, he was chased down by an Israeli police officer into an olive field, shot in the neck at point blank range, left for dead. Asil died because his ambulance never made it to the hospital because of checkpoints. In the aftermath of Asil's killing, there was an investigation at a fairly high level of the Israeli government called the Or Commission that found Asil's killing unjustified. That being said, no one was ever held accountable, personally accountable for Asil's death. And for me, Asil's death was pretty transformative. It's what caused me to leave the Middle East and go to law school and begin working on peace and reconstruction and trying to figure out how do we rebuild after this? Because my hope at the time was that the violence that was happening in the Middle East would be temporary and that we would eventually get back to a place where we've got to build two societies living side by side. That never happened, and obviously things have gotten much, much worse since then. But that was and has been a big motivating factor of why I wanted to investigate police misconduct, and more importantly, later on, why I want to create safer communities for everyone. And I went to law school because I wanted to help understand how the law and how rule of law could be used to make more peaceful societies, and then later on how they could be used to rebuild after war. And so I went to law school with that mission, and my first job out of law school was in Kosovo with the U.S. State Department, trying to help rebuild that legal system. And when I was working there, one of my colleagues, who was a U.S. An AUSA in Chicago, had said, "Listen, you're a smart guy, but you've never actually done anything. If you want to go work on the rule of law, you need to go work in the system for a bit." And he told me I should be a prosecutor. I had no intention of being a prosecutor at any point in my life. I said, I really care about civil rights. So if I'm going to go be in the system, I want to go be a defense attorney. And he said, if you really care about civil rights, you have to be a prosecutor because they're the ones with all the power. And that was how I got into prosecution. I did a detail at the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., where I handled domestic violence and sex crimes cases and quickly realized that I enjoyed the work and I was good at it. And I wanted to keep prosecuting after that.
And it's from there that you go to Civil Rights Division at DOJ?
Yeah, so I did that detail for about 11 months. And during the time that I was working there, I actually, at the time, current Attorney General Jonathan Skrmetti of Tennessee was also on detail at the U.S. Attorney's Office, and we became friends. And he, at the time, had was working for DOJ Civil Rights, and he said, "You're good at this. You should come work for Civil Rights." And so I went over to DOJ in the Civil Rights Division, where I worked on enforcing federal civil rights law, which included hate crimes, human trafficking, and police misconduct cases.
Are you still in touch with Skrmetti?
Yeah.
I did not. And you're still friends? Or just. Casually
I
in
mean,
touch. Happy
we're
birthday,
we're
and that's it.
we're in touch.
I had no idea. Okay. So you said you were raised in a Jewish family. Can you tell me a little bit more about? I'm just curious, was it a very religious observant family, or are you more culturally Jewish, not religiously Jewish?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we were not particularly religious. My grandparents on my father's side fled Nazi Germany. They were living in Austria and fled in 37 and came and started a new life in America. And I think very much culturally a part of their lives, but had been questioning the existence of God and so on. But as I was being raised, my parents thought it was important to educate me in that way. So I went to a Jewish school in Atlanta, and as a good student in any environment, you try to learn as much as possible. And so I was very much into how I could be better at that. And so very much social justice was infused into virtually everything we did in high school and the youth groups that I was a part of and the summer camps that I was a part of. And so that very much was the foundation of our Jewish life.
And was there an aspect of social justice that your family or your parents emphasized, like, I don't know, homelessness or racial equality, or was there a certain type of activity, or was it just sort of social justice broadly?
I mean, I would say broadly. However, my mom did a lot of work um, helping low-income women get jobs. So she ran a program for a while that was trying to prepare those folks so they can go get better jobs. Uh, in medieval Jewish thinking, the philosopher Maimonides said there's 8 levels of charity, 8 levels of giving, with that highest level of giving being to give someone employment so they're no longer requiring to charity. And so I think that was very much a part of the philosophy is how do you lift people up to the point that they're no longer dependent on charity? That's really what we should strive as a part of our giving.
So going back to civil rights, so now Attorney General of Tennessee Scarametti encourages you to come to the Civil Rights Division. I love that I owe my friendship to you to Attorney General Scarametti. But so you go to Civil Rights DOJ, and how long do you stay there? Do you like it right away? Are you questioning if you're in the right place? How does it start?
It starts because I very much want to fight for civil rights. And the way that that particular job worked, because we handled cases all over the US, was you're on the road a lot. And in those early years, I was in Texas and Tennessee and North Carolina and Georgia. And my thought was, like most attorneys in that office, I would last for about 3 years because that was about the average lifespan of a civil rights lawyer in the Justice Department at the time. Much to my surprise, I lasted 14 years and wound up really enjoying those cases, partly because every case was a little bit different. I got to see a lot of the US and how different communities were struggling with civil rights. I would be dropped into a place, often at the time of their biggest civil rights problem, whether it would be a high profile hate crimes or a police shooting. And my job was to try to piece together what happened and to get some form of justice.
So why, at least at the time, was the life expectancy 3 years, and why did you last 14?
Well, I think the life expectancy of 3 years is it's tough on one's life. I was on the road at least 2 weeks out of the month. It's disruptive if one has a family, which I did, and so it's challenging, particularly as people start to have small kids, to be away that much. I was able to do it. I had a very supportive wife and extra help around the house in order to be able to make that happen. Um, and I really, really liked the work. I think part of it was I had kept getting interesting cases. I found it really interesting to explore how do we heal in the aftermath of these cases? How do we hold people accountable after these cases? And ultimately, how can we make broader changes in our communities and in our systems so that we can have a more just, fair society? I think ultimately, after having done the job for so many years, I began to question whether or not that was the only way or even the best way to try to hold people accountable. I think what most people want in their communities is they want to live in safe communities. They want to be able to live their best lives. They want their government and their law enforcement to be fair and just. And that is what we are striving for. How do we live in a more pro-social environment where people take care of each other and don't hurt each other? I think for far too long, our solution has been the punitive process, right? We punish people when they violate the law. And that is a form of accountability, but I don't think we should ever confuse punishment for justice. And I don't think we should ever confuse punishment for accountability. And so, fast forward about 12 years in, I was working a case down in Charleston, South Carolina, the murder of Walter Scott by a North Charleston Police Department officer. Walter Scott was pulled over for a broken taillight. During the course of that stop, he was shot in the back 8 times by a police officer. The whole thing was captured on video. The state initially charged the officer with murder. That case resulted in a hung jury, and they had asked the feds to come in and try to hold this officer accountable. And I was the feds. I was the one who came in at a time when Charleston was very much on edge. This was 2015. It was the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. Ferguson and Freddie Gray had happened. Cities were burning. And there was the hope that the federal government could come in and secure a conviction in this case. So I ultimately led the team that got the conviction of Michael Slater for the murder of Walter Scott. And it was undoubtedly the biggest victory of my career at that point.
And just for listeners who might not know, remember, that's the case with the famous video where the officer doesn't just shoot him on video. Doesn't he drop or plant a gun next to
A taser.
Walter Scott? A taser, right. A weapon next to Mr. Scott's body, right?
Right.
Right.
Right. So
This was in national news.
And it was the clearest video of a bad police shooting I had ever seen, and my job was to watch bad police shooting videos. And so when I saw that video for the first time, it was the clearest case of a bad shooting that I had ever seen. I figured there was no way I would ever actually go and handle this case in court because the state would handle it. The state, on the other hand, was concerned they couldn't get a murder conviction, and so had invited the federal government to be there in case. And that proved to be important because there was ultimately a hung jury. The Scott family, much, I guess, to my surprise, but they were very much calling for calm. I think Charleston owes a huge debt to the Scott family for saying, trust the process. The feds are coming. Let's trust that process. Of course, that only upped the stress and the pressure on me because there was so much tension at that time. But when we got the conviction and I was standing there at the courthouse steps after that victory, I did not feel that sense of overwhelming victory and justice that I had felt in the past. And I think that was because by this point, after having done the job for 12 years, I had come to the realization that, no matter what we did, Walter Scott wasn't coming back. What I knew was that in the 2.5 years it took for us to investigate and prosecute that case, over 2,500 other people died in interactions with the police. And I knew that the systems and structures that contributed to Walter Scott's death, like the policy on pretextual traffic stops that was causing police officers to pull over people 3-4 times a day on the hope that they would find contraband, but was often quite discriminatory in its impact and ineffective as a law enforcement tool. But those kind of policies and procedures were going to still be in effect. And when you feel like this after the biggest victory of your career, that's when you know it's time to get a new job.
So I have so many questions. Let me just think on it for a second.
Is this where you're going to put one of those thought bubbles in at the end? I love Alyssa thought bubbles.
No, I'm just trying to organize my thoughts. It's funny because you said you were at DOJ for 14 years, but Walter Scott, that victory was in 12 years in, so you stayed 2 more years.
Yes.
So was that just a matter of trying to figure out what to do next? Obviously, you've got kids, you've got bills to pay. I'm trying to nicely say, what took 2 more years?
Yeah, I mean, I started immediately looking for jobs, and as it turned out, there was no other jobs I wanted to do.
Hmm.
Um, one starts to think like, well, what am I good at? Well, I was good at investigating and trying cases, and I didn't want to investigate and try other kinds of cases. Like I was doing civil rights cases; those were the cases I wanted to do. And so then, when you have to start thinking, all right, well, that next level, what do I want to do next? I want to work on some of the system reform work. So I looked at who was doing that kind of work and what kind of jobs were available, and I didn't really want any of those jobs. And so I was very, very much floundering about what I would do next until I got a call from Solicitor Scarlett Wilson down from Charleston, South Carolina. She had been the elected prosecutor who was working on the Walter Scott case, and I got to know her quite well during that time. And in the aftermath of that case, she would often call me up as she was thinking about new policies, particularly as it related to police shootings, and would pick my brain like, "What do you think about this?" And so that was the nature of our relationship in the aftermath of that case. And one day she called me up and she said, "Listen, we've been collecting data on all of our prosecutorial decisions for the last 5 years, and I can't find anyone to help me make sense of it. Do you think it's possible that we could use data to figure out whether or not we are being fair and effective as prosecutors in our office?" And when she asked me that, I said, I have no idea, but that's the kind of question that I want to spend the next part of my career trying to answer.
And what year was that?
2019, I believe.
Okay. And I remember now what I was going to ask is, can you remind me when Walter Scott was relative to the mass shooting at, I can't remember the name of the church, but the black church where a white supremacist came in and killed, what was it, 9 people, 9 black people in a Bible study group?
Yeah, so Walter Scott was killed in April of 2015. And then 3 months later, a white supremacist, Dylan Roof, walked into Emmanuel AME Church and massacred 9 parishioners during the course of a Bible study. So it was in 3 months. And so the city in particular was extra heightened at that time.
And did Civil Rights DOJ handle that case? Because I assume
Yes.
as a hate crime, that's okay.
Yes. And so at that point in Charleston, two of the biggest civil rights cases in America were in Charleston, South Carolina.
Okay. So Solicitor Wilson calls you and you say, that sounds interesting. Tell me about your experience in education in statistics and numbers.
I didn't know anything about statistics or numbers or data. I had read the book Moneyball, and I was convinced that if the Oakland A's could use data analytics to win more baseball games, then perhaps we could also use data analytics to make the criminal justice system more fair and effective.
Okay.
So that was about what I knew at the time.
And so tell us about, how long does it take you to figure out, actually, this is what you're going to do? Like, do you raise money and then quit your job? Like, I literally want to know how this all plays out.
Well, the first thing I had to do was to figure out from someone who knew something about data whether or not this actually made any sense. And so I went to GW Law School and I reached out to them to try to find someone in computer science and analytics, and eventually got connected to Don Brayman at the law school, who's a bit of a unicorn because he is both a lawyer and a data scientist. And we had coffee and I sat down. I said, this is the proposal. Charleston, South Carolina wants to use their data to be more fair. Is this a thing? And Don said, absolutely, this is a thing. Like, I have been trying to get other government offices to begin to think about data to make better policy. And you have someone who wants to use this data to be more fair. Like, of course we should do it.
I want to take a moment to pause and think through how instrumental GW Law, a higher education institution, ended up being in the formation of Jared's really important nonprofit. Obviously, as someone who works at Vanderbilt, I have my biases. But I just want to say that in an environment where the federal government and public at large does not always seem to see the value in higher education, this is just one of many, many examples of situations where colleges and universities can and are playing a key role in making a positive impact in our communities. Yes, sometimes I have seen academics write articles or research papers where the real-world relevance is low. But I just want to emphasize that every day, those who work at law schools and other parts of universities across the country are helping hospitals, nonprofit organizations, and the private sector develop ideas or projects that require smart and experienced researchers to make big, lofty goals a reality. All right, let's get back to the interview where Jared talks about getting the Justice Innovation Lab off the ground.
And right around February of 2020, I got all of the pieces going. I had decided I was leaving in May of 2020. And for those of you out there with a short memory, we all know that the world changed pretty seriously come March 2020 when a global pandemic took over. So I now had all of my pieces in order. I was ready to leave DOJ, start this new thing. And I thought to myself, is this a terrible time to leave my cushy federal job? And I questioned that decision for a bit. And then I decided, you know what? I don't know that I will ever get all these pieces together at the same time again. And so I'm just going to do it. And because it's the pandemic, things will be slow. I'll have a little bit more time to get up and running. Though, of course, 2 months later, George Floyd was murdered in Minnesota. And now there was all of a sudden a lot of attention focused on racial equity, on justice reform. There was all sorts of new money flowing in for investment. And so instead of taking it slowly at the beginning of a pandemic, we were now 0 to 60 and jumping right into it.
So when you left DOJ, did you have staff hired already, or
No,
did you have money?
I had money, but no staff.
Okay, so you hire, and I just think, I know we're getting in the weeds, but I think this is helpful for people who want to start nonprofits who are listening. So how do you put together your team? How do you decide who you need? Given
Well,
that you, no offense, but you have zero qualifications to do data work.
Well, thank you.
You're
No
welcome.
offense. No, I mean, and in retrospect, perhaps there was a little bit of hubris involved. On the other hand, it actually meant it was really important who I hired and who I hired first. So Don Brayman continued on as an advisor. We were doing work at GW, so we had access to GW Law's resources. And one of the candidates that Don suggested that I interview was Rory Polvino. Rory, at the time, was at the AG's office in DC. He had previously worked in the DA's office in San Francisco, lawyer by training, but also a real policy wonk, another unicorn who can do both the data and the law side of the house. And Rory came on as my first full-time hire. At the time, I was getting support with some part-time people and some students, and then bringing Rory on the team really allowed us to grow a robust data team. And I owe most of my data education to Rory and Don, who made it clear to me what I actually needed to know, and more importantly, how we could use some of the concepts behind data to actually make better decisions as prosecutors.
So tell us the basics of Justice Innovation Lab. You know, big picture what you do, and then maybe an example or two of projects that you're doing or you have done.
So, big picture is we are trying to help prosecutors and criminal justice systems writ large make better decisions for safer and more fair communities. What has become clear to me over the course of 20 years working in this space is that our justice system is broken. And it's our justice systems are broken, I should say, because I think a lot of times we think about the justice system as if it were a singular thing, but really it's thousands of different things. Each county and city has its own justice systems that function relatively independently. And so we work with the leaders of those places who are ready to try something different, who have identified a problem in their jurisdiction and they want to fix it. And they want to fix it by thinking about the problem differently, by using data, by using systems thinking, by using concepts of human-centered design to begin to design new thoughtful solutions to solve their problems. So in Charleston, we weren't even sure what the problem was when we started there. We started with this concept of, are we being fair? Well, fairness is a bit of a squishy concept, and what we're trying to do is to use the data to understand that. So you've got to begin to thinking about, well, what does that even mean? So I would say, at a high level, the most important thing I learned really early on is that the most important thing to know about data is that data is counting. That's really the most important thing to know. But data only matters, number one, if you can rely on the numbers that you are getting so that you trust them as being an accurate reflection of reality. And number two, it only really matters if we're counting the right things. And so, as prosecutors, historically, we've counted two things. We've counted how many people have we convicted and what is our conviction rate, and we've counted how long have we sent people to prison. And while those are indicators of whether or not we are doing our job, I think there's a lot more that we can count. And so, as we started diving into all of this data that we had in South Carolina, we had to think about, well, what are we counting? Of course, you can look at fairness from raw numbers. So, how many people are incarcerated, and are there differences between, let's say, black people and white people, or between low income people and higher economic people? And we can look at per capita rates based on how many of those type of people are in a particular city. Um, One of the things that was important for the prosecutors to look at was, are we treating similarly situated people similarly? Meaning, right, we know as a part of their decision making, they were considering the severity of the case, they were considering criminal history, they were considering the strength of the evidence. And what was interesting was that we saw, like, for the most part, the answer was yes, they were treating similarly situated people similarly. However, when you looked at the raw numbers of outcomes, for example, how many people were incarcerated, how long were people sentenced to, that was overwhelmingly being impacted. The impact was being borne by black defendants. And the question was, how is this possible? How are there such unequal outcomes if they're treating similarly situated people similarly? And a lot of that came down to who was entering the system. In Charleston, South Carolina, you were 5 times more likely to be arrested if you were black than white. You were 6 times more likely to be arrested for a drug offense. And you were 10 times more likely to be arrested if you were a black man under the age of 30. And so when you had these very big differences in inputs into who was coming in the system, even if you treat everyone fairly once they're in, you're going to perpetuate some inequality as they move through the system. And one of the areas where we saw this being particularly problematic was in cases that were dismissed, because black defendants were having their cases dismissed 3 percentage points more frequently, which was pretty significant when you controlled for everything. And the question was, why? Are the prosecutors being more lenient for black defendants? Well, as we dug into what the underlying facts were, was no, those defendants were being arrested on weaker cases. And so the question was, okay, well, we have a responsibility as prosecutors to screen out those weaker cases faster. And it was taking them 220 days on average to do it. And so that became the problem that we really wanted to focus on. How can we identify cases that are insufficient, get those cases out of the system as quickly as possible? Because we know as people stay in the system longer, it makes it more likely that they will offend in the future. And it can be incredibly destructive to their housing, to their family, to their jobs. And so our hope was to intervene in that system early.
So these are your findings, and what happens as a result?
So one of the things that we were doing is running design thinking workshops for prosecutors' offices, where we're educating offices, number one, on what metrics should we even be counting and how do we think about that. Educating them on systems thinking as a medium for breaking down a problem so that we can figure out where we may have some leverage points to be able to fix problems. And then engaging in design thinking workshops where it's about coming up with new ideas to solve problems. So we ran one of those in Charleston, South Carolina, and one of the ideas that we quickly settled on was, can we have a person whose job it is to screen cases earlier in the process to identify these cases? And if we did that, would that increase the number of people we get out of the system? Would it speed up the process overall? And then the big question was, what impact would that have on recidivism? But we set up a pilot, initially only looking at one police department, Charleston Police Department, and we had one part-time prosecutor, and that was it. And his job, he got assigned cases and he reviewed them. And very quickly we realized, oh, he can move cases so much more quickly. And so once we had validated the pilot, we added a second attorney, we added more charges, we added more police departments, and then ultimately we ran it as a randomized control trial to see whether or not this was beating the normal process.
So, okay, so go on. So what's the randomized control trial result?
So we recently completed this, and it was pretty astounding. Um, the screeners were able to identify and dismiss cases 150 days faster than business as usual. So almost 5 months faster. Uh, in doing so, they saved about 3,000 days of incarceration by quickly getting resolution, getting people out of jail
Over what period of time?
over 18 months.
Okay.
And in doing so, saved about 400 court hearings that never had to take place. For those 200, I believe it's 240 people who were impacted this, they didn't need public defenders, so it saved having to appoint public defenders to those 240 some odd cases. And all told, saved the county over $400,000 in fees that are normally associated with criminal justice in terms of those jail beds and those hearings and the defense costs. And so it was a pretty remarkable savings. And the people who got their cases dismissed early were 5 percentage points less likely to be rearrested in the following 6 months.
So what is the difference between the screening unit and just having all of DAs do a better job screening? I mean, can you go into the mechanics a little bit about what the
Sure.
screening unit is and where it was in relation to the process before?
So the normal process was someone would be arrested. They would then show up at bond court for their initial appearance, and then the case would be assigned to a deputy who oversaw a particular police department. So Charleston has 5 teams. One of those deputies is in charge of Charleston PD, one is in charge of North Charleston PD, Mount Pleasant, the county, etc. Well, that deputy is also a trial attorney. So that deputy is probably in court. They might have a trial. They might not look at an incoming case for 2 weeks. And then when that person gets the case and says, okay, I'm going to pass this on to a junior attorney, that junior attorney also has a caseload and they may be in trial for 2 or 3 weeks. And what we know as prosecutors is no one is really putting the time and attention to reviewing their case until there is a triggering event like a status hearing. And so what was happening was the case would move through the system with no one having the responsibility of evaluating the case for sufficiency. But everyone who gets the case subsequent believes that the people before them have already kind of done this. And it's that was not accurate. No one was. The person at bond court wasn't screening out cases. The deputy was rarely screening out cases. And so what this did was it changed the decision-making authority, moved it much earlier in the process so that they could say, hey, we can make a decision generally the night of the arrest if we have all the paperwork. And so the goal was, what are the kinds of cases that we can make a decision on early? How do we make sure we have all of that information as early as possible? And then can we give it to a person who can make that call? So the screener was a very experienced homicide prosecutor. He had been doing the work for 20, 25 years. And he was able to look at cases and say, no, this is a problematic search. No, this case is like 0.00 grams. We're like not spending the next 4 years prosecuting this case. And so ranging from evidence sufficiency, elements, making sure the elements were all met, he and then ultimately the other screeners were able to weed those cases out before they get stuck in the
Do you know
system.
what percentage of the cases they were weeding out?
It's about 10%, between 5 and 10%, depending on at what time period we're talking about. Because
Okay.
one of the things that was interesting that came out of this experiment was the screeners decided that whenever they saw a bad case, they would email the arresting officer and explain why that was a bad case. Now, if you think about this from a feedback loop and an education, most of these police officers are pretty young. The training is not particularly sufficient. Their sergeants are not necessarily really guiding these people into what better policing looks like. But what the screeners were doing is saying, hey, you can't do this thing, or this evidence is insufficient because. And what we saw over time is that fewer and fewer bad cases were coming in because they were changing the behavior of the police such that they were bringing in higher caliber cases. So
Yeah.
this is something we want to explore more fully. We're doing a project in St. Paul, Minnesota right now that will hopefully touch on this as well, because prosecutors and police have to have a continuous feedback loop if we're going to improve behavior and outcomes.
So when you say you're doing this in Minnesota, do you mean a pilot, a study?
Well, right now we are studying their declinations. So when the police bring in the case, whether or not the prosecutors decline the case, and then specifically breaking down that subset of cases to try to understand, are there patterns that we see that are leading to higher declination rates?
Because I was going to say, if you want to replicate this, do you really need to do studies, or can you just tell every DA's office to put in a screening unit and save everybody the trouble and time?
Well, we can for sure. And I think people should be. At a minimum, every office in America should have a process for quickly identifying and removing cases for insufficient evidence. That to me is the floor of what I think every office in America should do. That being said, I think there is a lot more that we can do than that. We can use these intake processes to better identify people for diversion. We can better use these intake processes for identifying people where, yes, this was a crime, but it was a crime under a mental health crisis. And what this person really needs is stabilization on the mental health front. We can use it for various different things. What helps it with the data is every office has a limited amount of resources. So what Solicitor Wilson said early on is you can have one part-time guy, right? Like that's what I have available right now. And so in order to figure out what was Bruce going to do, we had to figure out, well, how many cases could Bruce actually review in a week? And then extrapolate backwards. Well, which cases can you make a decision on more quickly? Oh, these are the kinds of cases. And then from there, we were able to figure out, all right, this is what we're going to start Bruce on. And and when there was a realization that there was a massive cost savings and time savings, that's when they decided to put a second person on it. We were able to get some DOJ money to partially fund that position, and we were off to the races. So I think what is helpful is every jurisdiction is going to have different high volume cases. So if I were going to choose the types of cases that offices should immediately screen, it would be whatever is the highest volume in your jurisdiction. And that's going to vary from place to place, whether it's drug cases or maybe domestic violence cases, or there's some office where it's going to be traffic offenses. Those are the cases that require the closest look. I think as baby prosecutors, we were always taught like the misdemeanors aren't that important. The
Right.
municipal, it's not the murders, it's not the rapes. And I think that's been really bad advice
Yeah.
for lawyers, because for the people who are there on misdemeanor or municipal offenses, it's a really big deal.
Yeah, I
And
remember I was told on my first bench trial, this is a great opportunity because it's batting practice. And I remember even then it just sounded so wrong to call a case batting practice, because that's, even if the defendant's guilty, it's a serious situation. He's facing a conviction. And so, yeah, I also was told misdemeanors wasn't literally don't matter, but clearly don't matter as much. But in terms of the
right,
system at large, it is largely the system.
right. Well, and I think in most jurisdictions, it might be 70 or 80% of the
Yeah.
cases that are coming in. And so what I think is when we teach young prosecutors that these aren't that important, relative to the homicides and the sexual assaults, what happens is it creates a laziness, right? That, oh, I am going to deal with this case last. I'm going to deal with my serious case for, and so that's how those people wind up getting stuck in the system on an insufficient evidence for 220 days. And so I think there is a real importance of saying, yeah, no one should be in the system who's not supposed to be there. No one should be there on insufficient evidence, and we got to get those people out because once you are in, the damage compounds over time and has huge implications on employment and housing and liberty and all of these things.
And one question I wanted to ask about the screening unit, and then we'll move on, is so in Manhattan we had a screening unit. It was actually pretty sophisticated. It was a whole system. It was staffed essentially 8 a.m. to roughly 1 or 2 a.m. the next day. There were at least three misdemeanor assistants and then at least 2 or 3 felony assistants. There's no way we were dismissing cases at a 5 to 10% rate. So it's an unfair question because you haven't had a chance to really look at Manhattan, but do you have any idea why Charleston was so much higher than that? I mean, 5 to
No, I
10% is
actually don't
really
think
high.
I actually think that's par for the course. I mean, some of the places we looked with, they were at 25% declination rate. I mean, number one, it depends on what kind of cases.
I'm saying
But
our I don't actually know, but I mean, for me to decline to prosecute a case in a shift of 20 plus cases was not an everyday thing. And that's 1 out of 20. So it's okay if you don't have an answer, but I was
I
wondering if
mean,
you had any.
I don't know what kind of cases you were seeing, but I think 5 to 10% is is probably the norm in across offices. That 5% easily, um, right, which can be a lot of people.
Right,
If you're talking about an office that makes 10,000 arrests in a year,
right,
which 10,000 arrests is a city of 800,000 is about what
right.
we're talking about.
Okay,
And so that's a lot of people.
right. I'd love for you to talk about the accelerator project that we're working on. I want you to talk about it because it's kind of your brainchild and you've been taking the lead on it. But it's something that we're excited to be participating in at Vanderbilt.
Yeah, so the accelerator came out of the workshops we had been running in Charleston and Memphis, and the question was, how do we get more jurisdictions to try new policies that we can then evaluate to see if they work? A big part of the Justice Innovation Lab approach, and what I think we need to see in more policy making, is a great degree of humility and more scientific thinking. Because when we make changes to the system, it can have pretty profound impacts on all of the people in the system. And so the accelerator was born out of the idea that we can get more jurisdictions to try to solve problems using data, using systems thinking, using design thinking, that they will then reach a point where they are piloting a solution to a problem that they have identified, that they will have metrics to evaluate whether or not they have achieved what they are trying to achieve. They'll have a budget to figure out how we're going to pay for it. And then our hope is that we will find funders who say that is a good idea. I want to see if that works. And what we're seeing, as you mentioned, why isn't everyone just starting a screening unit? Well, like it's actually way easier now after Charleston because Charleston was they set out to figure out if it worked. They've got the numbers to support it. It's been relatively uncontroversial, and other people want to follow suit. Our hope is that the accelerator will come up with other solutions like that because even though we have thousands of different justice systems and the idea of reforming the justice system as a whole is like almost insurmountable, what is the advantage that we have is that any jurisdiction can try to do something different. Any jurisdiction can pilot something new. And if they pilot it in a way that we can study and evaluate whether or not it worked, then it becomes much easier to get other offices to adopt and to scale that idea. And so the accelerator project, we're working with jurisdictions across the US, and they're each developing, um, they will each develop a pilot program to address a problem. So right now we're in the problem identification stage, trying to figure out which problems each jurisdiction wants to address and who are the appropriate stakeholders that we should bring into that conversation. And then they will ultimately come to Nashville and to Vanderbilt in October and begin designing those solutions to be tested.
And I think to me, the most exciting aspect of it is that the goal is to not just have the elected DAs. In some cases, the elected DA might not even be here, but it's sort of, at least one relatively high ranking person from the office and people outside their office, right? So if, for instance, as a random example, we're looking at a diversion program with a drug court, the drug court judge might also be coming to Vanderbilt. So the idea is to have all the stakeholders there, not just the prosecutors come, which I think is what's most different about this project than other prosecution policy summits that I've seen in the past.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of systems thinking. I think a lot of times we focus on what is happening to us as prosecutors and all these other actors, but the reality is prosecutors influence the police, prosecutors influence the courts, courts influence what happens in terms of timing. And so if you're tackling a problem that requires multiple stakeholders' involvement, you got to bring them to the table and be a part of the design. Because one of the things that we have found in this process is that when you include lots of different impacted voices, people who are impacted by the decision, not only the prosecutors, but the courts or the police or arrestees or victims, and you include their voice, you get a more holistic view of what is possible. And often it becomes, oh, we never even thought about that lever, and now we've got a possible solution.
Right. Well, and the idea is that when they leave Nashville and they go home, they actually have those critical key stakeholders at a minimum aware of the hope for the pilot, if not totally on board and going to be helping put it together. All right, I'm good. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
No.
No? Okay.
Just long-time listener, first-time caller. Happy to be on the show.
Thank you. I want to share a quick story from the Accelerator Summit we held in Nashville a few months ago here at Vanderbilt Law School. Reese Fredrickson, the county attorney from Pine County, Minnesota, a small rural area, came to our summit, and he brought his victim coordinator and a deputy sheriff from his community. They were here to figure out how to get better cooperation from domestic violence victims in their community. Now, as part of the Accelerator program, they mapped out how a domestic violence case moves through their system. And what surprised them was that within 24 hours of an arrest, 4 different people from 4 different agencies would each call the victim. Now imagine being that DV victim, getting multiple calls and voicemails about the case while you're at work, or maybe even recovering in the hospital. And it's no wonder that some DV victims felt overwhelmed, irritated, or just too fatigued to engage. That doesn't really help build trust or encourage cooperation. But this program doesn't just highlight the problems in the system. It helps prosecutors identify and pilot a solution. And so one big takeaway for County Attorney Fredrickson and his team was to coordinate better, deciding who calls when so that victims aren't overwhelmed or pushed away. And this is exactly what makes the Accelerator program so different. It's not just a conference where DAs hear big ideas. They actually leave with specific plans they can take home and start using right away, with support already built in from others in the community. Sometimes the changes might seem small, but they can make a huge difference in how cases move forward. If you want to learn more about the program, please just shoot me an email. True Bill Talk is produced by Carrie Hayes from Koyo Strategies, Colin Nixon, Adam Grice, Estrella Lopez, and me, Alyssa Mark-Haderi. Many thanks to Jared Fishman for taking the time to share all of the challenges he has faced through his long and interesting career and what he's now doing with the Justice Innovation Lab. Thank you, and go do justice.